mean I'll see it.
There is a specific kind of silence that only exists in places where children used to be. It's not a peaceful quiet, it's heavy, like the air is thick with all the noise that just suddenly stopped one day. I grew up in a town that was basically a graveyard for industry, full of rusted-out factories and schools that were closed down before I was even born. But everyone knew about the old elementary school on the edge of the woods. It wasn't just an abandoned building to us. It was a wound that the town refused to let heal. People talk about urban legends like they're just stories, but in a place like that, legends are usually just uncomfortable truths that have been polished by time. The story everyone told was about a woman named Mrs. Gable. She wasn't a ghost story to the older folks. She was a woman who used to shop at the same grocery store as my parents. She had a son, a quiet kid who died in a structural collapse in the basement locker rooms back in the late 90s. The school was shut down immediately after, partly because of the rot in the foundation and partly because the town couldn't look at the building without thinking about that boy. Mrs. Gable didn't leave, though. While the rest of the town moved on, she stayed. She'd be seen walking toward the school with heavy grocery bags or standing by the chain-link fence, just staring. Then, one day, she just stopped appearing. People assumed she finally passed away or moved to a facility. But the local kids started saying the basement lights would flicker at night. They said the showers were running. I didn't go there on a dare. I went there because I was working for a local contractor, and we were supposed to do a walkthrough to see if the copper piping was even worth salvaging before the demolition crews moved in. My partner for the day called in sick, and like a fool, I figured I'd just get a head start. The sun was still up when I cut the lock on the side door, but the moment I stepped inside, the light seemed to lose its strength. The hallways were lined with lockers that had been pried open and stripped, looking like the rib cages of dead animals. The floor was covered in a carpet of wet, pulpy paper, old tests, drawings, and notebooks that had turned into a gray sludge over decades of leaks. It smelled like wet concrete and something else, something sharp, like old pennies and bleach. I made my way toward the back of the building, where the stairs led down to the gymnasium and the locker rooms. The air got colder with every step. My flashlight beam was the only thing cutting through the dark, and it kept picking up things that made my skin crawl. There were piles of clothes in the corners. Not old gym clothes, modern clothes. Hoodies, sneakers, a denim jacket. They weren't scattered, they were folded neatly, as if waiting for someone to put them back on. When I reached the basement level, the sound started. It wasn't a voice. It was the sound of water. A steady, rhythmic pulsing, like a heartbeat made of liquid. I followed it into the shower area. The tiles were originally white, but they were coated in a thick, black grime that looked almost like velvet. The smell hit me then. It was a wall of rot so thick I actually gagged into my shirt. It wasn't just the smell of a dead animal in a wall. It was the smell of a butcher shop that had lost power in the middle of a heat wave. I rounded the corner into the main shower bay, and that's when I saw the nursery. Mrs. Gable was there. She was sitting on a rusted metal folding chair in the center of the room. She looked like a skeleton wrapped in parchment paper. Her hair was gone, replaced by a few wisps of gray fuzz, and her eyes were clouded over with thick, white cataracts. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the large, central floor drain. She was humming. It was a low, tuneless vibration that seemed to rattle my teeth. In her lap, she held a plastic bowl filled with something dark and wet. Every few seconds, she'd reach in with a rusted spoon and drop a glob of whatever it was into the drain. "He's growing so fast," she whispered. Her voice sounded like dry leaves skittering across pavement. The others, they didn't have enough marrow. But he's getting stronger now. I should have run. My brain was screaming at me to turn around and never look back, but my flashlight caught the edge of something sticking out from behind her chair. It was a human hand, or what was left of one. It was pale, stripped of most of its skin, and the fingers had been systematically broken and folded back. It was part of a pile, a literal mound of human remains that had been harvested with the kind of precision you'd expect from a surgeon. The true crime rumors about missing hikers in the area suddenly crashed into my head with the force of a freight train. This wasn't a ghost story. This was a slaughterhouse. Mrs. Gable? I managed to choke out. She didn't startle. She just turned her head. Slowly, her neck vertebrae popping in the silence. A wide, toothless grin stretched across her face, pulling the skin so tight I thought it would snap. "You're a big one," she muttered. "Lots of red in you. He likes the red." Then the drain reacted. The water sound didn't stop, it changed. It became a wet, slurping suction. Something began to pull itself up through the iron grate of the floor drain. I watched, paralyzed, as fingers, too many fingers, and far too long to be human, poked through the gaps in the metal. They were translucent, the color of a drowned corpse, and they moved with the jerky, unnatural twitching of an insect's legs. The grate didn't just pop off, it was pulled downward, crushed like a soda can by whatever was underneath. What climbed out of that hole wasn't a boy. It was a mass of pale, slick flesh that seemed to have no bones. It was a collection of parts, limbs that didn't match, eyes that were mismatched and cloudy, all fused together by a thick, translucent membrane. It looked like an anatomical drawing that had been melted and reshaped by a lunatic. Mrs. Gable reached out and stroked the thing as it pulled its bulk onto the tile. She didn't seem to care that its touch left a trail of caustic, yellow slime on her arms. She looked at it with the purest, most terrifying love I have ever seen. "Eat, Leo," she cooed. "Eat and grow for Mother." The thing turned toward me. It didn't have a face, not really. It had a vertical slit where a mouth should be, lined with rows of jagged, needle-like teeth that looked like they had been stolen from a deep-sea fish. It made a wet, clicking sound as it lunged. I didn't think. I just threw my heavy industrial flashlight at the thing and bolted. I heard the flashlight clatter against the tiles, and for a second, the room went pitch black. Then, the most horrific sound I've ever heard echoed through the basement, a wet, tearing noise, followed by the sound of Mrs. Gable laughing. "He likes the chase," she screamed. "He likes it when the blood is hot." I scrambled up the stairs, my boots slipping on the slick, rotting paper in the hallways. I could hear it behind me. It wasn't running, it was flowing. It sounded like a wet, heavy bag being dragged over gravel. Each time it moved, I could hear the wet thwack of its flesh hitting the floorboards. I burst through the side door and into the evening air, and I didn't stop until I reached my truck. I fumbled with the keys, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought I'd have a stroke. As I pulled away, I looked back at the school. In the second-story window, directly above the entrance, Mrs. Gable was standing. She was holding the thing, that monstrous, pale shape, against her chest like a baby. She was waving at me with her free hand. I went to the police, of course. I told them everything. They did a full sweep of the building 2 hours later. They found the piles of clothes. They found the mound of remains in the basement. The DNA tests later confirmed they belonged to 6 different missing people from the last 3 years. They found the rusted folding chair and the plastic bowl. But they didn't find Mrs. Gable. And they didn't find the thing in the drain. The lead detective told me the basement floor was solid concrete, and the drain I described led to a collapsed sewer line that had been dry for a decade. He tried to tell me I must have hallucinated most of it due to the mold spores and the trauma of finding the bodies. But I know what I saw. I know the difference between a hallucination and the smell of a mother's rotting love. Sometimes, when it rains really hard, I sit in my house and listen to the water rushing through the pipes in the walls. I stay away from the bathroom. I keep the lid on the toilet down, and I've taped over the shower drain in the guest room. Because every now and then, when the house is quiet and the night is late, I can hear a low, tuneless humming coming from the pipes. And I know she's still out there, somewhere in the dark under the world, waiting for the next person to come close enough to the edge of the train.
Next story.
The layout of my childhood home was something I could navigate blindfolded, and for most of my life, it felt like the only place in the world where nothing could actually go wrong. It was one of those old, split-level builds with creaky floorboards and a kitchen that always smelled faintly of cinnamon and old wood. My mom was the type of person who filled a house with noise, humming while she worked, the constant clinking of coffee mugs, the rhythmic thud of a heavy cutting board. You don't realize how much you rely on those sounds until they start coming from the wrong places. It was late, somewhere in those heavy hours of the night when the rest of the neighborhood has gone completely silent. My dad was away on a business trip, so it was just me and my mom. I was upstairs in my room, lying on top of my covers with my laptop, just wasting time. The house was quiet, but it was that thick, pressurized silence you get right before a storm breaks. Then I heard it. "Honey, can you come down here for a second? I need help with these bags." It was her voice. It was 100% her voice. It had that specific upward lilt she gets when she's tired but trying to be cheerful. It came from the kitchen, directly at the bottom of the stairs. I didn't think twice about it. I closed my laptop and stood up, stretching my legs. I remember thinking it was weird that she'd gone out for groceries so late, but she was always prone to those late-night bursts of productivity. I walked out of my room and into the hallway. The light in the hall was burned out, so it was a long stretch of gray shadows. As I reached the top of the stairs, I glanced toward my mom's bedroom door. It was slightly ajar. I stopped. The door didn't just open, it moved with a slow, deliberate weight, like someone was leaning their entire body against it from the other side. A hand reached out through the gap. It wasn't a quick movement. It was a trembling, frantic clawing at the air until it found my forearm. Before I could even gasp, I was yanked inside the dark bedroom. A hand slammed over my mouth, smelling of cheap soap and old sweat. I started to thrash, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, until I heard the whisper right against my ear. "Don't go down there," she breathed. Her voice was cracked, barely a thread of sound. I heard it too. I froze. My eyes adjusted to the dark of her room, and I could see her. My mom. She was crouched on the floor, her face pale and slick, with tears. She was shaking so hard I could feel the vibrations through the floorboards. But if she was here, if she was right in front of me, holding me in the dark, then who was standing at the bottom of the stairs? We stood there for what felt like an eternity, both of us staring at the thin sliver of the hallway visible through the cracked door. "Honey," the voice called again. It was louder this time, more insistent. But now that I was listening with my heart in my throat, I noticed the flaw. The voice didn't have a breath behind it. It was flat. It sounded like a recording of her voice being played through a wet sponge. It was the imitation of a human sound, devoid of the actual mechanics of a throat and lungs. Then came the sound of footsteps. They weren't the footsteps of a person. They were heavy, wet, rhythmic thuds. Slap, drag, slap, drag. It sounded like someone walking in oversized boots filled with water. It started at the bottom of the stairs and began to ascend. My mom's grip on my arm tightened so hard her nails drew blood. I didn't care. I couldn't even feel it. I was focused on the shadows in the hallway. The thing stopped at the top of the stairs. It stood there for a long time, right outside the door. I could hear it trying to breathe. It was a wet, rattling sound, like someone blowing bubbles through a thick liquid. "I know you're in there," the voice said. It wasn't my mom's voice anymore. It was a collage. The first half of the sentence was her, but the second half was a deep, guttural rasp that sounded like grinding stones. Then the scratching started. It wasn't at the door handle. It was at the bottom of the door, right where the wood met the carpet. Long, slow strokes of something sharp. It sounded like a serrated knife being drawn across a leather jacket. We backed away toward the far corner of the room, near the window, trying to be as silent as the shadows. Suddenly, the scratching stopped. There was a heavy, meaty thud against the door, and then silence. We waited. 10 minutes. 20. The sun started to bleed a dim, sickly gray light into the room. Eventually, the silence became too heavy to bear. My mom stayed by the window, clutching a heavy glass lamp, while I slowly, agonizingly walked toward the door. I peered through the crack. The hallway was empty. I pushed the door open, my legs feeling like they were made of lead. I walked toward the stairs, looking down into the kitchen. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't cinnamon. It was copper. It was the sharp, metallic tang of raw meat left out in the sun. I walked down the stairs, one agonizing step at a time. When I reached the kitchen, I stopped. I couldn't breathe. There were no grocery bags. Instead, the kitchen floor was covered in long, thin strips of something pink and gray. At first, I thought they were rags. Then I saw the hair. They were strips of skin, long, surgical-looking ribbons of flesh that had been peeled off of something or someone and laid out in a neat, concentric circle in the middle of the floor. In the center of the circle sat the neighbor's golden retriever, or what was left of it. It had been turned inside out with a precision that didn't seem possible. There was no blood on the walls, no sign of a struggle. Just a clean, organized nightmare. I looked toward the back door. It was wide open. On the white paint of the door frame, there was a single handprint. It was huge, twice the size of a human hand, with fingers that looked like they had too many joints. The print wasn't made of blood. It was made of a thick, translucent slime that was already beginning to harden into a crust. I called the police, but they found nothing. No footprints in the mud outside, no DNA in the slime, nothing but a dead dog and a house that didn't feel like home anymore. They told us it was likely a disturbed individual, some kind of ritualistic sicko who had been watching us. But I know what I heard. I know the way that voice felt. We moved out a week later. We left most of our furniture behind. I didn't want anything that had been in that house. I didn't want to sit on a couch that might have been watched from the shadows of the basement. I live in a small apartment now, 3 states away. It's on the 4th floor, and I've replaced the hollow wooden door with a heavy steel one. I have 3 different locks, and I check them every night before I go to sleep. Most nights, I'm okay. I've almost convinced myself that it was just a person, a very fast, very sick person. But sometimes, when I'm drifting off to sleep, I'll hear a voice from the hallway outside my bedroom. It's my own voice. It's my own voice, perfectly replicated, asking me if I'm still awake. The worst part isn't the voice, though. It's the sound that follows it. That wet, heavy slap, drag against the hardwood. And then the slow, rhythmic scratching at the bottom of the door.
Next story.
My mom used to be the loudest person in the house. You know the type, always humming some song, clattering dishes in the sink, or yelling for me to come down and eat. She was full of life, maybe a bit too much sometimes, but she was the anchor of everything. Then, something just shifted. It wasn't like a slow decline or a sickness you could name. It was like someone had reached into her head and flipped a switch from on to pause. The first time it happened, I didn't even realize it was a thing. I walked into the kitchen to grab a glass of water, and she was standing by the counter with a head of lettuce in one hand and a knife in the other. She wasn't moving. I thought she was just deep in thought, maybe zoned out after a long shift at the hospital. I said her name, but she didn't react. I stood there for a good minute, watching the clock on the stove tick, and she didn't so much as blink. Her eyes were fixed on a spot on the backsplash, white and dry. I eventually touched her shoulder, and she jumped, immediately going back to chopping the lettuce like nothing had happened. She laughed it off, saying she was just tired. But that was the start of the rot. Over the next few weeks, the freezing became more frequent and much, much longer. It stopped being about being tired. It started looking like a seizure, but without the shaking. She would just stop. I'd find her in the hallway, halfway through a step, one foot hovering off the floor, perfectly balanced like a piece of taxidermy. The scariest part wasn't the stillness itself, but what happened to her body during those gaps. I started noticing blood. Small amounts at first. I'd find her standing in the laundry room, staring at the washing machine, and her fingernails would be dug so deep into her own palms that blood was dripping onto the linoleum. She wasn't making a sound. No whimpering, no heavy breathing. Just that suffocating, heavy silence. When I'd finally managed to snap her out of it, she'd look down at her bleeding hands with this genuine, terrifying confusion. She'd wash the blood off, wrap her hands in bandages, and tell me she must have scratched herself in her sleep. But I knew she hadn't been sleeping. I knew she was disappearing inside herself. The house started to feel different. You know that feeling when you're being watched, but the person watching you isn't a person anymore? It felt like living with a mannequin that moved when your back was turned. I stopped sleeping well. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like her moving into position outside my bedroom door. I'd lay there, staring at the gap under my door, waiting for a shadow to block the light. The night it all peaked is something I still see every time I close my eyes. It's burned into my brain like a physical scar. I woke up around 3 in the morning. The air in the house was freezing, the kind of cold that feels like it's coming from inside the walls. I felt this intense, primal need to check on her. I walked out of my room. The carpet felt damp under my feet, though I couldn't tell you why. I reached the top of the stairs and looked down into the living room. It was pitch black, except for the pale, sickly moonlight filtering through the blinds. She was there. She was standing right in the center of the room, facing the far wall. There was nothing on that wall, no pictures, no television, just empty, beige paint. She was perfectly upright, her arms hanging stiffly at her sides. I called out to her, my voice cracking and small. "Mom?" Nothing. I walked down the stairs, each step feeling like I was descending into a deep, dark well. As I got closer, the smell hit me. It was a metallic, iron scent mixed with something sweet and sickly, like raw meat left out on a counter. I walked around to the front of her, and I almost vomited. She was standing there with her eyes stretched so wide the whites were visible all the way around the pupils. She wasn't breathing. I mean that literally. Her chest wasn't moving. I held my hand near her face, and there was no air coming from her nose. She was a statue made of flesh. And then I saw her mouth. Her lips were pulled back so far they were starting to tear at the corners. Tiny beads of dark, viscous blood were welling up in the cracks of her skin. She was forcing a smile that shouldn't have been physically possible. It was too wide, too jagged. I could hear the faint, wet sound of her skin stretching to its breaking point. I started crying, begging her to wake up, to stop doing this. I reached out to touch her face, but my hand stopped an inch away. Her skin was radiating a heat that felt like a fever, despite the room being like a meat locker. I stood there for what felt like hours, just me and this thing that looked like my mother. Then, without any warning, her neck began to move. It wasn't a fluid, human motion. It was a series of sharp, rhythmic jerks. Each movement was punctuated by a sickening, white click from the vertebrae in her neck. She turned her head toward me, but her body stayed perfectly still, facing the wall. When her eyes finally locked onto mine, they weren't her eyes. They were empty. There was no soul behind them, just a vast, hungry vacuum. That smile, it widened even further. I heard the distinct sound of a tooth cracking under the pressure. She didn't say a word. She just stared at me with that horrific, bloody grin. Then, the mechanical movement started again. She turned her head back to the wall, her movements stiff and calculated. She began to walk toward her bedroom. Her gait was wrong. She wasn't bending her knees, she was swinging her legs out in wide arcs, her heels slamming into the floor with a heavy, dead thud. I followed her at a distance, terrified of what I'd see if I got too close. She walked into her room and closed the door with a soft, final click. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat on the kitchen floor with the lights on, holding a steak knife, watching the hallway. When the sun finally came up, I heard her bedroom door open. She walked into the kitchen, wearing her robe, looking completely normal. She saw me on the floor and asked why I was up so early. I pointed to her face. The corners of her mouth were scabbed over with dark, dried blood. There were bruises on her neck in the shape of fingerprints, her own fingerprints. I told her what happened. I told her about the wall, the smile, the way she moved. She just looked at me with this pitying expression. She laughed, a normal, warm laugh that sent shivers down my spine, and told me I must have had a vivid nightmare. She went to the mirror, looked at the blood on her face, and simply said her lips must have chapped in the cold air. She acted like she didn't see the bruises. She acted like everything was fine. But I know what I saw. I saw the thing that lives inside her now. It's like something is using her body as a suit, practicing how to be human but not quite getting the movements right. Sometimes I'll be sitting in the living room and I'll hear a faint, white clicking sound from the other room. I don't go to check anymore. I just stay where I am and pray that she stays still. Because I know that one day, when she freezes, she might not come back. And whatever is left standing in the hallway won't be my mother at all. I'm writing this because I heard her door open a few minutes ago. I'm in the bathroom now, with the door locked. I can see a shadow through the gap at the bottom of the door. It hasn't moved in 20 minutes. I can hear the sound of someone's skin stretching, a slow, tearing sound, and I know that if I look out there, she'll be smiling at the wood of the door, waiting for me to come out.
Next story.
I honestly don't care if you think I'm losing it. You've known me long enough to know I don't make things up for attention, and I'm definitely not the type to get spooked by shadows or a creaking floorboard. But what happened in that house, it changed the way I look at everyone. Even the people I love. It makes me wonder if we ever really know who is standing right in front of us, or if we just see what our brains expect to see. The house was quiet that night, that heavy kind of quiet that feels like it's pressing against your eardrums. My mom was in the living room. I remember seeing her as I walked past the doorway on my way to the kitchen. She was sitting on the edge of the old floral sofa, the one with the frayed armrests, surrounded by piles of laundry. She was doing that thing she always does, folding the warm towels and smoothing them out with her palms over and over until they were perfectly flat. The television was on, but the volume was muted, so the only thing filling the room was the blue, flickering light of some late-night talk show. I didn't say anything to her, and she didn't look up. She just kept moving her hands in that rhythmic, mechanical way. I went into the kitchen because I was thirsty. My throat felt like it was coated in dry salt. I stepped onto the cold linoleum and reached for a glass, but I stopped dead before my hand even touched the cabinet. My mom was standing at the stove. She was wearing her favorite oversized beige sweater, the same one I had just seen her wearing in the living room 3 seconds ago. She was holding a wooden spoon, slowly stirring a pot that was simmering on the burner. The smell of it hit me all at once, thick, savory beef stew. Steam was rising in pale, white clouds, clinging to the underside of the cabinets. I stood there, paralyzed. My heart didn't just start racing, it felt like it was trying to punch its way out of my ribs. I looked at her back, watching the way her shoulders moved as she stirred. It was her. It was her hair, her height, the way she tilted her head to the left when she was focusing on something. I opened my mouth to say something, but my voice was gone. It felt like I had swallowed a handful of sand. I slowly backed out of the kitchen, keeping my eyes on the figure at the stove, and I looked back into the living room. She was still there. My mother was still on the sofa, folding the same blue towel. But this time, she stopped. She didn't turn her head. She just stopped, moving her hands, and sat perfectly still. The silence in the house became deafening, like the air had been sucked out of the room. I looked back to the kitchen, my head spinning so fast I felt sick. The kitchen was empty. The stove was off. The pot of soup was gone. The smell of beef and herbs had vanished, replaced instantly by the stale, sharp scent of old dust and something metallic, like copper or raw meat. I walked back into the kitchen, my legs feeling like lead. I touched the burner where the pot had been. It was ice cold. Not just room temperature, but unnervingly cold, like it had been sitting in a freezer. I felt a wave of absolute, primal dread wash over me. I turned around to go back to the living room, to tell my mom what I'd seen, or maybe just to make sure she was actually real. When I got to the doorway, she was looking at me. She wasn't folding laundry anymore. The pile of clothes was scattered on the floor. She was just staring. Her eyes looked different. They were wider than they should have been, the whites showing all the way around the pupils. "Did you find what you were looking for?" she asked. Her voice was her voice, but the cadence was wrong. It was flat. It sounded like a recording played at the wrong speed. I couldn't answer. I just backed away toward the hallway. I needed to get to the front door. I needed to be outside, under the streetlights, away from the flickering blue glow of that TV. As I moved, I noticed something on the floor near the sofa. It wasn't a towel. It was one of my mom's shirts, but it was shredded, soaked in something dark and wet. The woman on the couch stood up. The way she moved wasn't human. It was jerky, like a puppet being pulled by tangled strings. She didn't walk, she lunged, her joints clicking and popping with a sound that made my stomach turn. I didn't wait. I bolted down the hall, but as I passed the basement door, I heard something. A muffled, wet thudding. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was instinct. I ripped the basement door open and hit the light switch. Down at the bottom of the stairs, slumped against the washing machine, was my mother. The real one. Her beige sweater was dark with blood, her throat opened up in a jagged, messy line that looked like it had been carved with something dull. Her eyes were glazed, staring at nothing, but her hand was still moving. Her fingers were twitching against the cold concrete floor, smoothing out a stray sock as if she were still folding laundry in her mind. A shadow fell over me from the top of the stairs. I didn't look back. I slammed the basement door and locked it from the inside, even though I knew it wouldn't matter. I could hear the thing upstairs. It wasn't pretending to be her anymore. I heard the sound of heavy, wet feet dragging across the floorboards. Then the scratching started. It wasn't a normal scratch. It sounded like bones scraping against wood. I crawled into the crawl space behind the furnace, pulling the heavy plywood cover over myself. I sat there in the dark, smelling the iron scent of my mother's blood and the damp earth of the foundation. I stayed there for hours, listening to that thing pace back and forth directly above my head. It was heavy. Every time it stepped, the floorboards groaned under a weight that no woman could ever have. Sometimes it would stop right above the crawl space. It would stand there, perfectly still, for 30 minutes at a time. And then it would start speaking. It used her voice. It called my name over and over, asking if I wanted some soup. It talked about the laundry. It talked about how the towels were still damp and needed to be dried. The transition from her sweet, motherly tone to a deep, guttural rasp happened mid-sentence over and over again. By the time the sun came up and I finally worked up the courage to crawl out, the house was silent. I climbed the stairs, my heart in my throat, and pushed open the basement door. The living room was empty. The laundry was gone. The blood on the floor had been wiped away, leaving only a faint, circular stain that smelled like bleach. I ran to the kitchen. The stove was clean, but on the counter there was a single ceramic bowl. It was filled with a thick, dark red liquid. It wasn't soup. It was viscous, clotted, and filled with small, white fragments that looked like teeth. I called the police, but of course, they didn't find her. They didn't find anyone. They found the bleach stains on the soup, but when they ran the DNA, it didn't match my mother. It didn't match anyone on file. It was human, they said, but it was degraded. Like it was ancient. I live in a different state now, in a small apartment with 3 different locks on the door. I don't visit home. I don't even like to look at photos of her anymore. Because sometimes, when I'm folding my own clothes, I catch a glimpse of someone in the reflection of the window. They're standing right behind me, wearing a beige sweater, holding a wooden spoon. And when I turn around, there's nobody there, but the room always smells like copper and beef. I think the worst part isn't the fear that the thing will come back for me. The worst part is the memory of those last few seconds in the basement, looking at my mother's body. I can't stop thinking about how, even when she was dying, she was still trying to fold that sock. She was trying to keep things normal. She was trying to be my mom while that thing was upstairs, learning how to take her place.
Next story. Next story is yours. Take a look at the shadow in the corner of your room. Are you sure it was that shape a minute ago? Subscribe or be the next in line.